Hello, welcome back to the Great Games in Najdorf, and today we'll see a wonderful game played by Garry Kasparov defeating Vishy Anand. So, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, of course Najdorf. Vishy chose here the classical line, bishop e2, e5, knight b3, bishop e7, castle, and bishop e6. Well, here I recommend castle, but it transposes to some main lines. Bishop e6 is another big line, so f4 was played in the game, queen c7, and knight d5. Bishop d5, e d5, and knight bd7. Black has to play knight bd7 before castle, actually, because black really doesn't want to take on e5 with the pawn. So c4. Instead of c4, there is bishop e3, knight b6. Now the d5 pawn is in trouble, so white has to give up the dark squared bishop, and bishop b6, queen b6, king h1, castle. Black is really comfortable, but the only problem can be c4, rook a c8, rook c1, g6, and c5. But of course this is not dangerous for black. After dc5, fe5, knight d7, and bishop g4, white pins the knight on d7, but black sacrifices an exchange, knight e5, bishop c8, rook c8, and has domination on dark squares. Bishop will block the pawn on d5, knight on e5 is very strong, controlling so many squares. And black has full compensation. So let's get back to the game. Knight bd7, c4, and castle. Well, why not knight b6? After fe5, de5, knight d2 protects the c4 pawn, bishop d6, queen e1, queen wants to jump on king side, and e4 is no good because of rook f6, gf6, and knight e4. Bishop h2 doesn't help, king h1, bishop e5, and d6. White has a perfect knight on e4. The queen is also very good on e1 because it has many possibilities to jump on many squares, and the king is still in the center and still very weak. Queen d8 was played, c5, knight d7, and bishop g4. So black has a huge, white has a huge advantage. So castle. Instead of knight b6 was played in the game, king h1, rook fe8. Rook is always useful on e8, especially in this position. Bishop e3. a4, with the idea of a5, is met by a5 itself. Bishop e3 and b6. Now we can see that all dark squares is controlled, and the knight on b3 is really problematic for white. Rook c1, e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and knight e4. The c5 square is again in big control. Bishop comes to f6, and black has very good position. So bishop e3, ef4, bishop f4, bishop f8. Black should not hurry with knight e5 because of bishop e5, d-e5 and c5. Well, this is a pawn sacrifice, but after bishop c5, rook c1 pins the bishop on c5, so b6, knight c5, bc5 and b4. White gets the pawn back and has very good position. So bishop f4, bishop f8. Opening the file for the rook, and bishop on f8 is better than on e7 because after g6 it goes to g7. Rook c1, queen b6. Knight e5 here is possible as bishop e5 is met with rook e5, but knight d4, queen b6, rook c2, defending the b2 pawn, knight eg4, once knight e3, bishop g4, knight g4, knight f5, well, queen g4, queen d4 is okay for black, but knight f5, knight e5, b3, queen d8. Of course possible to play, but I like the move what Kasparov played. Well, queen b6 and rook c2. So in this position we stop for a moment and realize that a big problem for white is this knight on b3. It cannot jump to d4 because the b2 pawn was hanging, so rook c2 is kind of necessary to defend the b2 pawn, and g6. As I've mentioned before, bishop has a good square to g7, so bishop f3, rook a c8 and knight c1. Finally, white is able to get this knight to better square. So rook e1 was interesting, but black is okay after rook e1, queen e1 and knight e5. Of course, white cannot take bishop e5, d-e5, queen e5 because rook e8, white has a huge first rank problems. So queen c3 loses after bishop b4, queen g3 and a5. A very strong move. We need this d4 square for queen to go bishop c5 later on. Oh, sorry. And threaten the mate on g1. So if knight c1, queen d4, knight b3 is met by queen d3, and if some kind of random move like b3, then bishop c5. And mate is really unavoidable. So knight e5, c5 is possible, but after queen b5, black is doing okay. The rook is pinned, I'm sorry, the pawn is pinned actually on c5. So let's get back to the game. Knight c1, knight e5, b3. Supports the c4 pawn, h5. A very good move, makes the g4 square under control, h3, bishop g7 and knight e2. Now Kasparov took on f3, knight f3. One might think that the knight on e5 is so strong and the bishop on f3 is really bad because of the pawn structure. Pawns are on white squares, so the white squared bishop is really closed. It doesn't have to go anywhere. e4 square is under control, g4 square is under control. So why to take the bishop on f3 with such dominant knights in the center? But Kasparov realizes that this knight actually in the center is not doing anything, and this bishop controls a very important e4 square. So after knight f3, white has to take gf3 if he does not want to lose the battle of e4 square. For example, rook f3, queen c5, underlining the bad position of rook on c2 because now the threat is knight d5. So rook, if knight d4, then knight d5 of course, but if rook c1, so that bishop protects and knight protects the rook and there is no knight d5, then knight e4 with several threats. Knight f3, gf3. gf3 controls the e4 pawn, but now white has horrible pawn structure. Look at the h3 pawn. It's really weak. Queen c5 with the same ideas. Knight d5, so the rook on c2 is very bad. Rook c1 and b5. A very good move, opening another file for rook, b file this time. And if knight d4, then b takes c4, b takes c4, knight d7 is very good. Knight jumps to e5, and then, for example, after knight b3, queen a3, after knight e5, this pawn will be very weak on c4 and other pawns also has to be controlled. So b5, after cb5, queen b5, and the d5 pawn is weak and sooner or later it will fall because now the knight is under attack also. If, for example, rook c8 and bishop d6, then knight d5 and black is dominant on dark squares. So b5, and Anand played here queen d2. Now white misses the chance actually to improve the knight on e2 because this knight on e2 is really bad. bc4, bc4 and h4. A wonderful move makes h5 square free for the knight. So bishop g5, Anand hopes to win h4 pawn, and he wins actually after knight h5, bishop h4 and rook b8. Now we see the benefit of b5. The b file is open and the bishop on g7 controls the b2 square, so means that supports rook b2, and the knight on h5 keeps the bishop on h4 busy protecting the g3 square, because if bishop goes, for example, for bishop g5 for instance, there is a little tactic with rook e2, queen e2 and knight g3. So rook b8, And if rook c2 here, controlling the b2 square, queen c8, a very good move, attacking h3 pawn. Any king defense, I mean king h2 or king g2, is bad because of rook e2. King g2 is obviously bad because of rook e2, queen e2, and knight f4. And king h2 is bad again because of rook e2, queen e2, and knight f4, attacking h3 pawn and the queen at the same time. So rook b8, knight g1, rook b2, and now white is in real trouble. Rook c2, probably white hoped for rook c2 and somehow making black's attack not that strong, but he missed a little tactic, queen c4. The rook on c2 is pinned and the queen attacks many pieces. Rook c4 has Anand took rook d2 and f4. Now a logical move like rook c6 with double attack is really bad because the king on h1 is in mating net and this rook controls the second file. So there is only one piece on h4 which protects the g3 square. So after g5, white cannot take bishop g5 because of knight g3 mate. And if bishop f2, now we use the bishop on g7 with bishop d4. We can see how bad the bishop is on f2 because it is the only piece which protects the g3 square. So bishop d4 is again bad due to knight g3. Rook e1, just rook e5, and white loses the piece. Rook d2, and that's why Anand played f4 to control the g5 square so that black doesn't have g5. But after rook d5, he resigned because now black has extra pawn and white pieces are really bad. And this pawn on d6 will soon be a queen. I hope you liked the game and you will learn a lot from this game, and thank you for watching. See you next time.